Okay, I think we can already start with the introduction. So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone here to today's webinar on a holistic supply chain risk management approach in cooperation between Tengler Gluttig and Prewave. My name is Marek Hetzer. I'll give you some brief information before I hand over to Gregor Gluttig and Harald Nitschinger. First of all, this webinar will be recorded, and we will send out later the recording together with the slides of this presentation. And we have in total 1 hour, and there's a Q&A button in the bottom. So whenever you have any questions or comments, you can use that function to ask your questions. And then in the end, after the introduction, I will ask these questions and we can have a little Q&A session in the end. But as I said, whenever you have any questions, just feel free to use this function. And that's so far from my side. And now I would hand over to Harald Nitschinger for a short introduction.
Thank you, Mareike, and hi everybody. Welcome to our webinar from my side. My name is Harald Nitschinger. I'm one of the 2 co-founders of Prewave. And at Prewave, my role is to work on everything customer facing, from projects to sales and marketing and also product development. And I look forward to presenting together with Gregor today our approach on resilient and holistic supply chain management.
Okay, thank you, Harald. My name is Gregor Gluttig. Very warm welcome from my side. I'm very happy to have this webinar together with Prewave and to have so many participants here. A short introduction to for my person, I spent my whole professional life with supply chain management, half of it in the industry and the other half in the consulting. And 3 years ago, I founded the company Tengler Gluttig Consulting, the supply chain minds. And I will give you a short introduction on the company, what we are doing, very short, and then we are jumping after a short introduction of Prewave, we are jumping directly into the topic. So, Tengler Gluttig Consulting, we are management consultants, and we have made it our mission to improve the supply chains of our customers. We have our office in Vienna in the 1st district, and from this office we serve clients all over the world, and our portfolio ranges from maturity assessment of supply chains of different industries. We help companies to use the concept of anticipatory delivery, and we also develop digital supply chain strategies and select the right tools for the company to improve their supply chain. For example, the Prewave tool, and that's the first part. And the second part, also very important, is to enable the organization and the people to use new processes and new tools properly. That was a short introduction to Tengler Gluttig. Harald, please give a short insight to Prewave.
Absolutely. So Prewave is a startup, a software company providing a supply chain risk management platform that was founded in 2017 in Vienna as a spin-off from the University of Technology Vienna, based on the research of the other co-founder at Prewave, Lisa Smith. And behind Prewave, and that was also what we worked on at the University of Technology, is a artificial intelligence-based technology that allows us to identify risks in supply chains based on publicly available data. And with that data and with the technology and on our platform, we guide and bring our clients through the risk management life cycle, from identifying risks, mapping their supply chains. So what is the structure of my supply chain, but then to also evaluate and score those risks and to eventually take actions. And this is also the approach that where, of course, there's a lot of manual processes also involved, not just the software, but also the doing. And that is why today we have this joint webinar, and I'll give it back to Gregor to show you the approach.
All right, so short company introduction. I think if there is more information needed, we are happy to share it. now we want to jump into the topic of supply chain resilience. And first of all, I want to take a look back what happened in the last 2 years concerning supply chain. And starting, I think everybody knows, in February 2020, the coronavirus started and already had a huge impact on global supply chain. Already by mid-March, started in China, and the impact was already feelable in Europe by mid of March. In March 2021, there was a ship that blocked the Suez Canal, which also led to very high supply chain disruptions all over the world. Since more than a year, we are struggling, or most of the companies, which I know from different industries, are struggling with price fluctuations and lack of raw material. It started in April 2021 with wood. Wood price was an all-time high at this time of year, and it pursued in steel, aluminium, semiconductor, and so on and so on. And currently we are also heading to a lack of grain and wheat, as you know, possibly that Russia is stealing Ukraine's grain, as it was in the news today. So a lot of things happened in the last 2 years. Also, Russian hackers continue to attack global supply chains, global companies, and this all things lead to, next slide please. This leads to very high material costs, logistics costs, delays, lack of material, price fluctuations, and so on. So we have a very volatile environment, and also the coronavirus is not over, as examples show already in Shanghai or Portugal. So that's the look back. When I have a look into the future, I see that we're facing these challenges, and these challenges will more or less remain. Possibly, hopefully, the Ukraine war will end soon, and hopefully Corona will also end soon. But we have price fluctuations, we have disrupted supply chains, and a very volatile environment on the demand side on the one hand, and on the supply side on the other hand. And what we are, as a consultants, are saying that these, let's say, new challenges of global supply chains, on the raw material side and on the demand side, are facing a setup of supply chains which is, from our point of view, not the right setup for it. So it's a little bit outdated. So the current supply chain setup is, as you see here on an example from computer industry, we have global supply chains where metals are imported and mined, for example, in China. Components as chips, etc., are made in Southeast Asia, China, and US. Assemblies of a computer are manufactured in USA, Taiwan, Japan, Philippines. The final assembly, possibly, of the computer is done in Chongqing. Then their products are shipped worldwide from Chongqing and Shenzhen, and possibly to an end customer in Italy. So it's a very global supply chain, and all on this global supply chain and this many transport routes, disruptions can happen quite easily. So we have a lot of transportation, and I know a lot of companies which are struggling to find containers worldwide, or containers at a reasonable price. So this is one point. The supply chains of today are very focused on cost efficiency, just-in-time deliveries, no buffer, a very reduced supply base. We have high dependencies, for example, raw material and commodities, or for example, also semiconductor. As you all know, that most of the semiconductors, more than 80% of semiconductor contract manufacturing in 2020 was based in Taiwan or South Korea. 80%. So it's a huge dependency here. There is the European Chip Act currently taking place, as the European Union is funding a lot of money into the development of chip factories and semiconductor factories in Europe. But this will take years until we are that far to reach that amount we are needed. And a lot of outsourcing and centralization, meaning economies of scales, specified plant and warehouses. So we see that the current setup of supply chain is facing new challenges, which is not the best way to react to these challenges. Everybody is talking about resilience. It's became a buzzword in the last 2 years. But what does it mean? What does a resilient supply chain mean exactly? It means that when a disruption happens, that the delivery performance of a company does not suffer so much from this disruption, and the company can recover faster from this disruption. This is the bottom, or the core of resilient supply chains. And what does it mean? It means that we need, as a prerequisite for it, we need full transparency in the supply chain. We need instruments to control them, to control the supply chain. We have to be much more flexible in our own production capability and also in our supplier network. And we have to collaborate much more closely with clients and suppliers. These are the 4 pillars, and this is important to develop resilient supply chains. And how does that can look in practice, we will demonstrate in the next chapter, starting with the visibility.
But first of all, before we continue with our approach, as I have seen that we have some more participants now, I just want to give a quick reminder that whenever you want, you can use the Q&A function, and we'll collect the questions then. Also, it's recorded and we provide the recording later on. And at that point, we would like to have a little poll where you can also vote about your current risk management and about some measures that could help. Therefore, I would start the poll, and you should see it in a second. So, Harald, maybe you could give some more details about the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Prewave, when we work with customers, we typically try to understand where are they and what is the maturity of the risk management approach. And let's say that the lowest level of maturity is what we call a static risk management. And that is that actually maybe during the onboarding of a supplier, you get a credit report, but then nothing else happens. It's just static. Maybe once per year, there's some analysis. Maybe once every 5 years, there's an audit, but that is really a static approach. Now, the second maturity level is the reactive risk management. And that is once something happens, then we take action. So if there's a disruption, if there's some incident with a supplier, then we take a reactive action. But we are also always a bit behind the curve. With the proactive risk management, we actually use instruments, tools, processes, and software systems to get us into a proactive mode. That means, for instance, monitoring suppliers on an ongoing basis, doing a proactive risk management analysis regularly for the entire supply chain. That is the proactive risk management. And the last point, multi-tier proactive risk management, is actually the highest level of maturity. And that is when this proactive risk management is actually brought not just to the first level of suppliers, but really to the entire supply chain. Of course, with a focus on certain materials, but for the entire multi-tier supply chain. So yeah, we would like to ask you, where do you currently rate yourself and your organization? Static risk management, reactive risk management, proactive, or already multi-tier proactive?
Already see, or I can already see the first answers. I would wait a bit longer. It's yeah, quite interesting. Yeah, obviously we can't see from who comes which answer. So just feel free to evaluate. Okay, I think then it'd be interesting to see the first results. You should see them now. So maybe Harald, you can also say something about that, if that's something you expected, or how, yeah, what you experience in companies.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, that really reflects, let's say, the current landscape. So nobody in multi-tier proactive yet, because that's of course really the highest level, and it takes a lot of effort and years to do that well. But I think we currently see a lot of customers and companies in a very reactive mode, and they are taking the first measures to move into a more proactive mode. And I think that is really where most of the customers we are speaking with are, and that is also reflected by this poll. So yeah, very, very interesting.
So coming to the second question, maybe Gregor, you could say a bit about that, talking more about the measures, how to face such disruptions now.
Sure. Yeah. So in my experience, and when I'm talking with different clients and different customers, I always ask them how is their reaction on the current supply chain disruptions. And in my understanding, there are tendencies, and therefore I want to also use this opportunity to ask you, is this where are your tendencies? You can choose more options here. Do you increase your stock level currently? Because you try to increase your safety stock and be sure that you have the material available. Do you invest in digitalization, or do you even think about redesigning your network? So when your supply chain is disrupted, most of the supply chains are disrupted currently, what is your reaction on it? So what is your countermeasure currently?
Yeah, people are still voting. Wait a few more seconds. Okay, so let's have a look at these results.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. That does not reflect my experience I had with in the past. So redesigning the network with 64% is really interesting because a few weeks or months ago, people were just thinking about increasing their stock levels. So I think it's very good to think about new supplier base, possibly redesign also the production network. I think that's a very good approach if companies already think like that. Invest in digitalization is always good, yeah. As we will see also in the next chapter, and increase stock level. Of course, that's normal. The first reaction of most of the companies, but this is a little bit risky as well. I talked with a big medical device manufacturer, a German-based company, last week, and he told me that his company is investing most of their money into increasing the stock level, and he has very fear of the next month because if the demand, which is now quite good all over the world, is decreasing, and on the other hand, the rates, the index rates are getting higher and higher. We will have a working capital problem in the future. So I think this is quite a good approach that most of the companies, at least at that webinar, are investing in digitalization and redesigning the network as their core countermeasures. Thank you very much for this very interesting poll. All right. The next chapter, we Prewave and us developed a 6-step approach how to increase the resilience with advanced risk management, and that's our guideline for this webinar. As I said in the beginning, that the current supply chain setup needs to be changed, and therefore we would like to share with you a practical guideline and also an overview of selected tools, how you can make your supply chain more resilient, and that in a more sustainable way. Yeah? So the first 2 topics are about supplier mapping and risk identification, risk categorization, which is, let's say, core competency of Prewave. And then we will talk a little bit more about the mitigation strategies and strategy evaluation, which is more consultancy work. And 5 and 6, we will just go not that deep into that topic, which is because this is about the, let's say, the sustainable implementation of risk management within an organization. So we concentrate on step 1 to 4. And therefore, starting with number 1, with Prewave, as they have market leading functionality, how to create some transparency, I would like to hand over to Harald.
Thanks, Gregor. Yeah, so in this 6-step approach to a more resilient supply chain and to risk management, of course, the first step is to identify the risks that are sometimes hidden in supply chains, and then to evaluate them. And so to go one step further, at Prewave, we provide a set of tools that help you identify and map risks in your supply chain. That is supplier monitoring and risk alerting. So using our artificial intelligence-based technology that we developed since 2012, coming from the University of Technology, Vienna, we use publicly available data like social media data, news media data, to provide insights into what is happening at your suppliers. The next tool we provide to customers is commodity monitoring, where we use this technology that we've developed to monitor suppliers to go one step further and to actually monitor entire commodities. Because we've seen that particularly in the recent disruptions that Gregor also mentioned during the beginning, it's not always the failure of an individual supplier, but it's actually the failure of supply and capacity within an overall commodity, like semiconductors, like metals, like plastics, like wood, as Gregor mentioned. In the third step that we also have a dedicated slide towards is how can we actually come towards a transparency for the entire supply chain, not just the first tier of suppliers, but how can we use public data to go beyond the first tier into the second and third tier. And then, of course, we help our customers to be compliant with international legislation, the German Supply Chain Act, the upcoming European Union Directive on Supply Chain Due Diligence, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act in the United States. A lot of things are happening in the compliance space that also necessitate the identification of risks in supply chains. And maybe let me give you an example, an actual case study that shows you how we can bring those tools together. So one of our main customers at Prewave is the Volkswagen Group, and the Volkswagen Group today uses Prewave to monitor several thousands of their direct suppliers, but also several thousands of their indirect suppliers. And we have identified and implemented a 4-step process that we are also working on with them, where during the first step, we are actually mapping the supply chain within 16 critical raw materials. And this is already, let's say, a first risk-based approach, because in the automotive supply chain, there are certain critical materials and certain, let's say, less critical materials. The critical materials we decided to focus on are things like aluminum, steel, leather, cobalt, copper, but also semiconductors more recently. And we map those supply chains, identify them, in the case of, for instance, cobalt, the flow of goods all the way to the mine, using publicly available data. I will get to that in the next slide. And then for this supply chain, as we discovered and mapped it, we are then applying a monitoring where we use our AI to identify risk alerts and incidences that we use both for firefighting, so for the short-term management of risks that we were able to identify. And there we have also a clear prioritization of those risks, because if you monitor tens of thousands of suppliers, of course, you need a clear prioritization model to identify the important ones that need to be processed immediately. There we have managed to have Volkswagen with their tens of thousands of suppliers. On average, they are processing 5 such incidences per week. And this is actually a big success with a solution like ours to bring this down to this very manageable level. And then on top of that, we also have a regular review of suppliers based on the scoring that they have. So each supplier receives a score based on a combination of factors, like their historical risk alerts that they had. So is this a supplier where we had lots of labor strikes or accidents in the past? But we also look at the industry, the country risk, in order to come to an overall scorecard that is then used to regularly and periodically review those suppliers and take actions based on that. So that is the process we use to identify risks with the Volkswagen Group. And if you go to the next slide, we go one step further and explaining how we are approaching the problem of identifying the tier N structure of the supply chain, the multi-tier structure of the supply chain. And at Prewave, we are using a combined approach of 3 types of data sources. At Prewave, in order to bring transparency into the supply chains of our customers, we are combining public data that we are sourcing from media data, but also international trade data. So media data would be reference customer mentions on websites, or press releases on releasing certain customer-supplier relationships. Could even be annual reports of companies where they are sharing their key suppliers. But we're also using international trade and bill of lading data, which is publicized by a certain set of countries worldwide, like the United States, like Mexico, like India, and around 25 others that we are using to identify supplier and customer relationship based on public data. Then as a second source, we use private data. So our customers oftentimes have already some visibility in certain areas into the lower tiers of the supply chain, and they can add that. We call it private data because that is always private to them and that is not shared with any other customers on the platform. And then we have shared data, and this is the use case we are showing here. Yanfeng Automotive Interiors is one of the leading automotive tier 1 supplier for interior components. And together with them, we had a mapping initiative and a transparency initiative around certain commodities, for instance, like leather, where first we used public data, then we added the private data that Yanfeng already knew about where their suppliers are sourcing leather from. But then we also engaged and invited the suppliers to validate and share that information themselves. And there we really arrived at a great transparency into the supply chain of those commodities like leather. And that is, let's say, the approach to also identify structures and risks for the tier N supply chain. Then going to the next slide, and I think the second step in the 6-step approach is, of course, once we have identified a certain number of risks, and I already mentioned it during the case study with the Volkswagen Group, the next step is to actually evaluate and categorize those risks to understand where to prioritize and which ones to focus on. And there we provide a set of dashboards to our customers that are focusing around the risks you're seeing here on the right-hand side. So these are the risks we are covering for customers: industrial accidents, natural disasters, cyber risks, and so on. But really, if you look to the top left screenshot there, you see a risk matrix. And this is really the approach we use to evaluate and categorize the risk within supply chains, because here we look at a matrix, let's say traditional likelihood and impact matrix of understanding which suppliers have a high likelihood for risks because they had risks in the past or they are situated in an earthquake area. But then also on the y-axis, which suppliers are actually important to my business. We also call this consequence-based risk management. So if that supplier fails, what's the consequence? And is this a big consequence to my business because that's a single source supplier and I actually don't have a lot of stock with that supplier? Or is the consequence very low because the supplier is providing me a commodity and I can switch to a new supplier within the course of 1 or 2 weeks? And then we really, let's say, come to the point where we have a clear differentiation and selection of those suppliers that are in the top right of that matrix that are both risky, and if something happens, the impact is very large. And those are the ones where we now need to take mitigation actions and mitigation strategies. And with that, I hand it over to Gregor to show you how those can work.
Thank you, Harald. So step number 3 are the mitigation strategies. Once you have identified and categorized your risks, you have to think about, okay, what do I do to mitigate them and to counteract that risks? And within that step, it's important to define short, medium, and long-term mitigation strategies, and also evaluate and simulate that strategies with regard to stability and reaction to the risks. What does that mean based on an example? Starting possibly with the supplier collaboration. From my point of view, it's really important that we are going to collaborate within the supply chain much more intensively with the supplier, but also with the customer. And we can use, let's say, best-in-class systems or best-in-class tools to collaborate better and share also the information. Here you see a tool so-called Control Tower, where you get information about disruptions along your total supply chain. How does it work? So you get an alert if a disruption happens in your Control Tower. You have it visible in your Control Tower. You can assess the impact. You can simulate alternative scenarios, and you make a decision. within the tool, and this decision is then communicated again to the supplier or to the others affected entities within the supply chain. Let's make it clear on an example. This is an example from the automotive industry. And imagine that a lorry of one of your suppliers, a logistics service provider, has broken down in the Ukraine. So the customer order cannot be fulfilled. But as I mentioned, you're directly connected with your supplier and you get an alert with the company. You get this alert that the disruption happens. The control tower shows you also the opportunity that these goods, which were for the customer in the Ukraine, they are also stored in another hub in Spain. These goods are just reserved for another customer, but the factory in Poland can reproduce the goods as quickly enough and without changing any production schedule. So in this way, everyone, the customer in France and also the customer in the Ukraine, everyone can be, every customer order can be fulfilled, and all service level agreements can be met. So you have real-time data, and the dispatcher becomes more a manager and chooses the right decision within the supply chain. But this can only work if we are fully connected and we are fully collaborating closely with our main suppliers, with our main customers, and also with the logistics service providers, for example. Just one organizational remark. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to write them already into the chat. And we're answering that in the end of the session. So don't be shy and just ask your questions. We will have enough time to discuss them. All right. Second example, the network, the supply chain network, and also the inventory network. In this poll, we and the question we asked before, 30% or 35% said that their countermeasure to the disruptions are increasing their inventories. A lot of companies are doing that, and from my point of view, it's not the worst thing if you have in mind to allocate your inventories properly around the world. And this is an example from the construction industry, and they started with more than 100 branches, which had all inventories at all levels. So 100 branches, more than 100 branches with inventories all over the world. Our approach was to make a multi-level inventory management. What does that mean? That means that not every branch is holding every inventory they think they need. And we made 3 steps, 3 levels of inventories, or 3 levels of inventories. The first one was the production side, and who were responsible for the production of goods, of course. Who are also responsible for sourcing, it's the strategic suppliers, the distribution of the materials to the regional distribution center, and holding global central safety inventory. The next step, or we call it in supply chain management, we call it echelon. The next echelon is the regional distribution center. They were holding the regional safety inventory, the regional safety stock. So, and the impact of that is that we have a reduced lead time and also reduced supply risks, and also reduced currency risks. As you see here, this regional distribution center is based in Dubai, and the currency risk in Turkey, for example, the Turkish lira, with thinking about the inventories which are in place within the warehouse, we can therefore reduce the currency risk as well, as they are not in every country, but centrally at one place. Within that distribution center, we are also holding special equipment, which is not used that often. And this is a central source of supply for all the branches. And the branches are holding standard materials, so we call it the bread and butter business, holding buy parts and have a very low range of coverage to minimize the cost and the risks. So a very clear allocation of responsibilities and a very clear allocation who is holding which inventory to be much as flexible as possible on the one hand, but on the other hand, also not to increase the inventory to levels which are not affordable. So this was the example from construction industry about the inventories and inventory management. And the next, and I think the last one, is about production flexibilization. This is an example. It's also an OEM supplier, a cable manufacturer, and they have a so-called pull supply chain. A pull supply chain means that the demand starts at the sales organization. We see on the left side, Portugal, Italy, Sweden. There the demand starts, and the sourcing is done directly through this region, through a regional distribution center, or directly from the production. And before the order is allocated to a production, we have to make a so-called make or buy decision. This company is producing 70% of their material not within their own production factories, but with partner suppliers. So they have a 70% buy rate, and they want to increase their make rate, and therefore they had made this decision point, this make or buy decision point, and each order or each demand plan is allocated. On the one hand, is it better to produce it at a partner supplier, or is it better and cheaper to produce it at my own production? That's the first decision point. The second decision point is within my own production. If I say, okay, I make it on my own, I produce it on my own, I'm also able to allocate between twin factories. What are twin factories? Twin factories are production sites which are able to produce the same product. And therefore, again, I'm much more flexible if a partner supplier is not able to deliver, or one of my production sites is not able to deliver and to produce. I'm just more flexible to react within my own supply network, but also with my suppliers and my partner suppliers. And that is now important. Of course, there are some prerequisites for that. The first thing is that we have transparency along this whole supply chain, as you can see here. We have a software support. We are not able to allocate each order to a production site if it's not fully transparent and visible in the software. We have to have a defined set of rules for decision. It means in which case do I decide for production A, and in which case do I decide for the partner supplier. So what are the rules for decision for this allocation of productions? Is it the profit margin? Is it the overall equipment efficiency, or which are the KPIs I'm measuring here? And what is also important is that I have very flexible production capabilities, so that I'm able to produce one product at several sites. And I know a lot of companies, not only this OEM manufacturer, which are currently enabling their different production sites to be to produce not one product at one site, but one product at different sites. All right, then let's jump to the fourth point, the strategy evaluation. I will go quickly over that, but just that you understand how are the strategies evaluated, and how am I able to decide which is the right strategy for the right mitigation strategy for my company? And here you can see is I will go quickly over that, lots of text, but you will get the slides and therefore you can read it on your own. But just for understanding, this is also an example from automotive. And as you all know, that the disruption in automotive companies is often leads to a production stop, and a production stop in this case costs the manufacturer 10 million euros. So this, if a production stop happens, it costs 10 million euros. And what you do now is to calculate the so-called expected costs. And the expected costs are calculated with the cost, the 10 million euro loss in case of if it happens, and then you multiply it with the likelihood. And in this case, we say, okay, we have 5% likelihood that the supplier is not able to deliver, and 7% likelihood that there is some problem in the production. And if I multiply that is with the 10 million euro loss, the expected cost of that risk, of the production stop risk, is 1.2 million euro. And this is our baseline where we are starting from. And what I do now is to identify different measures and identify also what are the costs for these measures. But because if I develop a new supplier, if I do this production flexibilization I was just talking about, or if I build up inventory, all of these measures cost money and they reduce my risks. And that's what I have to compare. So I give you an example. The first example, multiple sourcing. So I build up a second supplier. So I have costs, initial costs for this, the building up of the supplier, but I also I have loss in the volume pricing benefits. So this is the cost of the measure. On the other hand, I reduce my risk, that the likelihood, so I can halve the likelihood that the supplier is not able to deliver. And so I reduce the risk, so the cost of the risks, which means when I multiply then the costs, let's say this 32K for the measure, and the expected costs for the residual risks are 725. This is 757,000 euro for this risk expected cost, and that is compared with the 1.2 million. So I try to identify what is the cost of the measure, how much am I able to reduce the likelihood for it, and then I try to find out what is the best measure to counteract for this risk. All right. So just two remarks for the two last points. Harald, maybe you for number 5, and then I will have one sentence for number 6.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, after this, let's say, measures and evaluating the right strategies on which mitigation measures to prioritize, of course, it's critical to then also monitor, control, and supervise the implementation of those efforts going forward, and to see whether this risk mitigation actually leads to a decreased risk profile in the supply chain. And this is really then a long-term, let's say, step of controlling and monitoring the improvement. And there we can also use the reports generated by the Prewave system to not just see the risks that have occurred, but also how they have developed over time.
Yeah, and point number 6 is about the embedment of risk management within an organization. So you have to integrate a clear risk management and decision-making process where with all stakeholders, if something occurs, if a disruption occurs, You need to have a task force which is able to decide. Software can help to bring the risk on the table, but you need someone who is able to decide and build also a true culture of risk awareness to embed that organizationally within your company. Good. So for our last slide, these are the conclusion, the takeaways. Harald, I think you start.
Yeah, I think the first point is quite clear that there's no other time where, let's say, TIN transparency was needed as much as it was now, and not just because the regulatory environment is shifting in that direction with the European Supply Chain Due Diligence regulation, which already includes the necessity to monitor the entire supply chain for risks, but also more local national legislation, like the Norwegian Supply Chain Act, for instance, is already covering the full supply chain. But of course, also in order to respond flexibly and quickly to disruptions, and many of the disruptions that are facing companies are not arriving from the first tier, but rather from structural multi-tier issues.
And I hope you've seen how resilient supply chains can work, and that they're also a competitive advantage nowadays to be able to anticipate unexpected disruptions, to respond quickly with the right tools, but also with the right organizational setup, and also recover quickly from the disruptions. And last but not least, we see that modern tools can help. They bring the transparency and also the necessary flexibility within my production network and within my supplier network. Then we can gain the transparency across all actors. For example, with Prewave, we are able to simulate the potential risks with control towers, and also have an integrated planning approach to proactively take action and therefore sustainably control our risks in a proper risk management setup. So on that, then I hand over again to Mareike, who will lead the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you. Gregor, we already got some questions. I would just start chronological. I think the first question is for you, Gregor. What does an implementation project on improving resilience with Tengler Gluttig look like? Can you give some example or tell us the regular steps?
Yeah, sure. Implementation approach. So before we start with an implementation project, we often try to make a so-called risk assessment and maturity assessment. So to identify how are the current maturity processes or risk management processes, how mature are the risk management processes within the organization, how mature are the tools which are currently used, and then develop with this, let's say, maturity assessment an approach and step-by-step approach how I'm going to embed these processes and how I'm going to use proper tools. And of course, we collaborate very closely with Prewave here together, especially in the identification of the risks and also in the categorization of the risk, which is always the starting point in developing this roadmap.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how long does it typically take to go through the entire process from the first analysis to defining the right strategy?
Maybe I can start, and then Gregor. So for the first two steps, the identification and classification and categorization of risks, that typically takes us 1 to 3 months, where we set up the suppliers of our customer and then score them to develop this risk matrix approach. What of course takes longer typically is then the implementation of the mitigation measures. But here I would like to hand over to Gregor to give some insights into how long this typically takes.
Yeah, sure. Of course, when we are going to simulate these different mitigation actions and strategies, it's always also, I would say, about 3 to 4 months, because the simulation needs a lot of data and to be able to decide properly on the right action. And of course, let's say the strategies are. If I follow this strategy, then I invest a lot of money. Imagine when I change my production network, or if I change my supplier network. This is nothing which is done from one day to the other, but it's a strategic approach, and therefore it takes longer, and therefore it's very important to have this strategy evaluated properly and know exactly what does it mean on my supply chain. So I would say for the strategy, simulation and evaluation, again 3 to 4 months, and then of course it depends on the action, how long that I start and build up a new supplier. If I relocate production to Europe, for example, then it takes often years, of course.
Thank you. Next, we got some insight from one participant. He said that they developed to use tactical and operational planning when demands are known for the next 1 to 6 weeks. And he wants to know, how can the risk measures be put into time horizon? So when do they take effect? Can maybe first the time horizon, and then also if it can make some automated algorithmic suggestions, like in short-term, mid-term, or long-term effects.
I try to understand the question now. It's a very long one.
So maybe first, like if the measures are more for short-term, mid-term, or long-term effects, or how can also affect it, or that's what I would understand, like the demand planning for the next 1 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit hard to answer that question, because demand planning is not something that we do with our software. What we, however, do is to, of course, do a general risk mapping of suppliers and supply chains. And there we do this suggested labeling, as it's mentioned in this question, where we try to highlight improvement areas. So if a supplier is situated in an earthquake area, or they have a lot of labor issues or accidents, then different types of measures are suggested by the system, and that of course can be done based on some logic. Not sure if that answers the question. Maybe Gregor, you have another angle to cover here.
Yeah, I think it goes a little bit hand in hand also with the control tower topic. Of course, when I've embedded a control tower and use them properly, then I can react quite also in short term, as I mentioned within the example with the lorry which was broken down in Ukraine and so on. This is of course short term, but the measure to implement such a control tower of course takes longer. And within a control tower, you normally have both. You have the short-term action for risk measures, but you also have long-term actions when you say, okay, about strategic sourcing or production allocation. So within these tools, I would say we have both short-term actions if a disruption already happened, and long-term actions to proactively countermeasure this possible risk.
And then to this question, it's also added, maybe that also refers to the control tower, but also to the Prewave solution. How can the risk measures be included in software for end-to-end solution? here, especially in the automotive industry or for automotive customers.
Yeah, I mean, so typically you want to document the measures you take. With the Prewave system, we're more and more also providing our customers with abilities to initiate actions and measures out of the system. For instance, requiring certain certifications from suppliers, requiring to provide statements, provide certain data. And with those measures that are taken, that again leads then into this controlling and monitoring of the progress, and other measures actually helping and leading to less incidences and less problems over the course of time. Yeah.
Thank you. And then there's one last question, but feel free to also add some more questions. What kind of data or data access is required for the implementation?
I think this goes into your direction.
Yeah, so for Prewave, for the Prewave system to work, we just need a supplier list. Yeah, so what we need is basically a list of your suppliers. Not much else actually. Maybe some information on the spend, but for the scoring model to work, it's really working with mostly public data, and we just need a list of suppliers with the name of the suppliers, the location of the supplier, and the rest, the identification of the industry, of course, of the location and so on. That all happens in the setup process in the Prewave system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think these are all questions now, but yeah, as we said before, whenever you have any further question or yeah, you want to reach out for some more information, please feel free to contact us whenever, yeah, for any more questions or details. Is there anything you want to add, Gregor or Harald?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay, then thank you very much for your attendance. And yeah, as I said, you will receive an email with the recording and also with the slides to have a further look in it. But yeah, that's so far from our side. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.